this is not intermission time. It's the name of the tune, however. Here we go. Intermission Riff.
It is the first Sunday in October. It is the first Sunday in November. Let's get the month right. You're listening to the House of Prog, www.houseofprog.com. This episode of Crosswinds begins as it always does. Our jazz theme is provided every Sunday, courtesy of the Stan Kenton Orchestra, doing a piece called Intermission, Riff. You're listening to Crosswinds. On this first Sunday in November, we are here till 2 p.m. Eastern Time, bringing you some great jazz. To put that groove in your lazy Sunday, thank you for tuning in. The first hour of this program, Big Band Music. Let's open up wide. This is Chase. A little bit of big band jazz fusion for you from 1971. That's a band known as Chase. It's a song called Open Up Wide. It is taken from their debut CD. Chase was an interesting big band. 4 trumpet players in the band, along with a rock and roll rhythm section. Keyboards, guitar, bass, and drums. Bill Chase, principal trumpet player in Chase. He was a big band trumpet player with Stan Kenton and Woody Herman, along with Maynard Ferguson back in the day. Chase was only around for about 3 or 4 years. airplane accident in Minnesota took the lives of Bill Chase and a number of the band members. I think it was 1974. They only released 3 albums. Check them out. The trumpet writing is phenomenal. You're listening to Crosswinds on this first Sunday in November. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I hope all of you are well and enjoying the change in time and the change in seasons. Here in America, we turned our clocks back an hour. So that just means it's getting dark a little early tonight. It's another sign that winter is coming. The jazz is always good in Crosswinds. Will be today up until 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Going to take you down to Birdland. This is Maynard Ferguson. first set of the big band session wraps up with Buddy Rich's big band. From the middle 1990s, they did 2 albums in the mid part of the 1990s. They were both called Burning for Buddy. These were albums recorded after Buddy's passing, and a couple albums featuring the music that the Buddy Rich Big Band played, and all of them had different drummers, kind of a tribute to Buddy Rich. The drummer on that particular track was Dave Weckl, very well-known jazz fusion drummer, best known for his work in Chick Corea's acoustic and electric bands. The song that you heard was called Mercy, 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 a song made popular by Cannonball Adderley back in the early 1960s, a song written by Joseph Zawinul, best known for his work with Miles Davis and Weather Report. Joseph Zawinul also wrote the first song that you heard in this set, which was Maynard Ferguson's big band doing Weather Report's classic Birdland. The middle song was provided by the Don Ellis Orchestra from their 1968 album called Shock Treatment. The song that you heard was called Mercy, Maybe Mercy. Going to go back to Birdland after a bit with a couple of songs featuring Count Basie's orchestra live at Birdland. But before we get there, this is Bob Mintzer and the Yellow Jackets. Something from a 2005 album entitled Old School, New Lessons. Bob Mintzer and his big band, along with the Yellow Jackets, providing the rhythm accompaniment. Mr. Mintzer on tenor saxophone on one of his pieces, as entitled Mosaic. Bob Mintzer been a member of the Yellow Jackets for many, many years. He is also the director of the WDR big band out of Cologne, Germany, who do a lot of contemporary big band recordings. Check them out. Big band music till the top of the hour. This set's going to feature the Count Basie Orchestra, a couple of live tracks recorded at the Birdland nightclub in New York City. We go back to the early 60s to begin this set by doing a little Segue in C.
Pearson at the piano, ladies and gentlemen. Glenn Pearson. Clarence Banks on the trombone. David Kime on the trombone. Mark Williams on the trombone. And Alvin Walker on the trombone. Trumpets.
It's a couple of live pieces done by the Count Basie Orchestra, all of them, both of them, recorded at the Birdland, a nightclub in New York City. We wrap it up with something from the mid part of the first decade of the 2000s. A song called Easin It, and we went back to the early 1960s for something called Segue in C, some great live music from the always great Count Basie Orchestra. First hour of Crosswinds is always big band music. And we're going to get you to the top of the hour by doing something from the Bob Curnow Big Band from their Pat Metheny songbook. This is something called And Then I Knew. we wrap up the big band portion of Crosswinds with something from the Pacific Northwest. Bob Curnow's big band doing a Pat Metheny, Lyle Mays composition entitled And Then I Knew. Bob Curnow released 2 albums featuring the music of Pat Metheny and Lyle Mays. Check them both out. Really, really good arrangements. First hour Crosswinds is always big band music. Thank you very much for tuning in to hour number 1 of the program. We'll do the same thing again next week. And now we're going to move on to hour number 2 and beyond of Crosswinds, heard live every Sunday, and we are live right now, courtesy of the wonderful people at the House of Prog, www.houseofprog.com. In case you hadn't noticed yet, it is straight up the top of the hour, straight up high noon on the East Coast of the United States, for all of you who forgot to turn your clocks back an hour last evening. At least those of you here in America, it is high noon on the East Coast of the United States. The next couple of hours of the program are going to be very, very special, as we are going to honor the musical legend and legacy that is the drummer and percussion player Jack DeJohnette, who passed away last week. Jack DeJohnette played on probably thousands of jazz recordings over the past 55 to 60 years. Everybody from Miles Davis to Bruce Hornsby. So we're going to put Jack into the percussion and the drum chair for the next 3 or 4 sets, bringing you a variety of jazz styles. Starting out with the first set here that features Bruce Hornsby and Jack DeJohnette. They did a couple of albums together, and they were also in Bruce's piano trio. Going to start with something from a Jack DeJohnette album entitled Sound Travels. This is from the year 2012. Bruce Hornsby on vocals. This is called Dirty Ground.
We will shout aloud, won't bow down, walk proud, give no ground. Shout aloud, won't bow down, and we won't bow down on the dirty ground. Been through the cane, dirtied up water, feeling just like a lamb that's about to slaughter. Been down on my knees, but I'm rising up, I've got to believe. Take what they're needing. I'm committed to my block, all my family and my friends that we're feeding. And our ways won't be washed away in the flood's rage and despair. I lost my house, but I don't care. My heart's not as heavy as my suit on the air. On the dirty ground. get yourself some, and we'll be ready next time when the hurricane comes. We gonna shout loud, won't bow down, won't proud, give no crown. Shout loud, won't proud, and we won't bow down on the dirty ground. Shout loud, won't bow down, won't proud. stopped, and I'm floating there on air. I can watch myself, my head is elsewhere. I'm suspended in midair. But surprise, surprise, I'm still here. So there, cognition is a billion years ago somewhere. Let's slip out of this life we know into some timeless repose. Hey, come on, let's go down to 73 below. Let's go sliding down the scale. Hold on down beyond the bed. I'll be feeling fine at absolute zero. Memory, identity on another self-plane, and you will be sustained with cryopreservatives, robotized enzymes, nucleotides, in time vitrification. Brain edit, you will get it if you let it, frozen. Hey, come on, let's go down to 73 below. Let's go sliding down the scale, way down, down beyond the veil. Time restarts, another chance of maybe better next time. We'll be minus 110, maybe that'll do just fine. Low temps, slow metabolism down, and then we will stop the gradual slide for centuries and on end. Frozen to solid for 100 years and then emerge. You will recount to yourself, oh what a lovely fantasy turn. Hey, come on, let's go down to 73 below. Let's go sliding down the scale, hold on down beyond the veil.
Hour number 2 of Crosswinds begins with 3, featuring Bruce Hornsby on piano and vocals, Jack DeJohnette on drums. We wrap it up with something from Bruce Hornsby's album called Absolute Zero, released in 2019. You heard the title track from that album. The middle track that we played, the instrumental, was from a 2007 album entitled Camp Meeting. The Bruce Hornsby Trio, the only time Bruce actually recorded a straight jazz trio album. Bruce on piano, Christian and McBride on bass, Jack DeJohnette on drums. You heard the title track from the album Camp Meeting. And we started with something from a Jack DeJohnette album called Sound Travels, released in 2012. Bruce on piano and vocals, and Jack on the drums with a song called Dirty Ground. We're featuring the legendary Jack DeJohnette today in honor of his life. He passing away a little earlier this week, and as I mentioned at the top of the hour, he played with pretty much everybody who's been in jazz since about 1967 or so. Countless albums. I'm barely scratching the surface as I try and give you a good cross-section of his abilities. While he played with many artists, he was best known for his work in the jazz trio, predominantly the jazz piano trio. Here is something featuring Bill Evans on piano and Eddie Gomez on bass. This is something called Some Other Time. Something in that set from the legendary Bill Evans. Doing the piano, Eddie Gomez doing bass, Jack DeJohnette on drums. That's the title track to an album that was released just a couple years ago. The album and the song called Some Other Time, which apparently were lost sessions recorded in Germany back in the early 1970s. Real good piano trio work. And of course, anything featuring Bill Evans in piano trio format is going to be exquisite. Bill Evans, just masterful piano player. Do hope you enjoyed that. We are featuring, in this section of Crosswinds, a look back on the musical legend and legacy that is Jack DeJohnette. I'm going to go a little bit fusion for you in this particular set, featuring Jack in the drum chair on these two tracks. We begin with Gary Peacock on bass, Paul McCandless on saxophone, and Dewa Budjana, guitar player out of Indonesia, on guitar. This is something called Ujung Galuh. from a 2016 album entitled Zentuary. Budjana on guitar, Gary Husband on the keyboards, Tony Levin on bass, Jack DeJohnette on drums, as we get the musicians right on that track, because I did not have them correct when I led off with that track. That is something from Budjana on guitar from Indonesia. We keep it going with Jack DeJohnette with this particular piece. It's called Dancing. Two songs in that set, and we wrap it up with something from 1996. From an album called A New Standard, Herbie Hancock on piano, John Schofield on guitar, Michael Brecker on saxophone, Dave Holland on bass, Jack DeJohnette on drums, Don Alias on percussion. The album is called A New Standard, and that's a song called Love is Stronger Than Pride, and that is a song originally written and recorded by Sade back in the day. Before that, something from a Jack DeJohnette album entitled Parallel Realities, released in 1990. Jack on drums, Pat Metheny on guitar, Herbie Hancock on keyboards. Doing a Pat Metheny number called Dancing. You're listening to Crosswinds. Thank you so much for tuning in. I do hope all of you are well and enjoying the change in the weather this first weekend of November. Another reminder for all of us in America, I hope you turn the clocks back an hour or so. We will be here for about another hour. We'll get you to 2 p.m. Eastern Time, as close as we can, at least. One of the things that Jack DeJohnette was most known for was his collaborations with Gary Peacock and Keith Jarrett. Keith, of course, on piano, Gary Peacock on bass. They formed what became known as the Standards Trio, releasing 3 albums of jazz standards, and here is something from the first Standards album, released in 1983, a jazz classic called All the Things You Are. Something from the Standards Trio in that set. Keith Jarrett on piano, Gary Peacock on bass, Jack DeJohnette on drums. They did a number of recordings as the Standards Trio. They were actually a performing group for about 30 years. Real cool stuff. You want to hear some great jazz piano, great jazz trio work? Check out the Standards set of albums. You are listening to Crosswinds. Thank you very much for tuning in just about to the top of the hour, just about to 1 o'clock on the East Coast of the United States. Couple more sets of music that feature Jack DeJohnette on drums, as we have been featuring him for the past hour or so. Jack lived in the Hudson Valley of New York, and he got together with some other very wonderful jazz performers back in 2017 and recorded an album together called Hudson. Jack on the drums, John Schofield on guitar, John Medeski on keyboards, and Larry Grenadier on bass. Here's something from that album called Tony Then Jack. We are into the third hour of Crosswinds, which is brought to you live every Sunday, 11 a.m. until 2 p.m. Eastern Time, courtesy of the wonderful people at the House of Prague, www.houseofprague.com. We get into hour number 3 with Gonzolo Rubalcala on piano, Ron Carter on bass, Jack DeJohnette on drums. From an album called Skyline, released in 2021, that's a piece called RonJackRuba. And then before that, something from Hudson, from the only album that the four of them released back in 2017, self-titled album. And the song that you heard was called Tony, Then Jack. Going to try and get you as close to 2 p.m. Eastern Time as we can. And this set will be a follow-up to Hudson, something else from their 2017 album. This is a song originally written by Joni Mitchell and originally recorded by Crosby, Stills, and Nash. It's called Woodstock. We did 2 songs in that set. Both of the songs featured Larry Grenadier on bass, Jack DeJohnette on drums. Song you just heard featured Ethan Iverson on piano. He, from Minnesota originally, was the original piano player in a band called The Bad Plus. Now Ethan is on his own, creating some very, very cool jazz. That's from an Ethan Iverson album called Every Note Is True, released in 2022. And the song that you just heard was called For Ellen Raskin. Before that, the second song we have featured from the quartet that called themselves Hudson, from their 2017 debut album, and the only album that they've released today. The song that you heard is called Woodstock, classic rock song, in a speaking sense, written by Joni Mitchell. John Schofield on guitar, Larry Grenadier on bass, John Medeski on keyboards, and Jack DeJohnette on drums. I do hope you've enjoyed our look back at the legendary career of Mr. Jack DeJohnette. One last song featuring Jack on the drums to leave for you before we start to close things out for this episode of Crosswinds. This one is a little bit different. It comes from an album called In Movement. It was released in 2016. This is a trio, but it's a little bit different trio. Jack DeJohnette on drums, Matt Garrison on bass, the son of Jimmy Garrison, who was the bass player in John Coltrane's classic quartet, and Ravi Coltrane on saxophones, John Coltrane's son. This is also a very interesting song written by Verdine White. From Earth, Wind, and Fire, this is called Serpentine Fire. a 2016 album entitled In Movement. A little bit more free jazz for you in that particular set. That's an Earth, Wind & Fire song called Serpentine Fire. Ravi Coltrane on saxophones, Matt Garrison on bass, Jack DeJohnette on drums. I want to thank you for tuning in this episode of Crosswinds. Before we close things out with some Pat Metheny, I have one last set of 4 to leave for you. We just did a Verdane White song in that last set. Let's do another one. This is Earth, Wind & Fire from an album called Gratitude. Sing a Song.
Shout out, sing a song, it'll make a way. life that breathes in me. If you were to say forever, we would always be together. And for me, there's nothing better. You're the biggest part of me. Well, make a wish, make a wish, make it come true. Make a list, make a list of the things he'll do for you. Ain't no risk now. Let his love rain down on you. He will wash away the past, so that we may start anew. More than an easy feeling. He's my joy, see. How can I tell you what it means? What it means to me. Found someone who believes in me. Make a wish, make a wish. When I love will make it come true. Make a list, make a list of the things he'll do for you. Ain't no risk now. Let his love break down the I'll wash away the past, so that we may start anew. Rising up on my shoulders, getting stronger as a older. All I wanna do is serve him, and he's the life that breathes in me. And your word to say forever, we will always be together. And for me, there's nothing better. You're the biggest part of me. You're the life that breathes in me. You're the biggest part, biggest part of me. Hard bodies, soft emotions, so fast, so smart. The world is at your feet, but what about your heart? Fame and fortune can't hold you tight. The late, late hours of the night. How do you stop? How do you stop? All before it's too late. You choose and you lose if you hesitate. How do you stop? How do you stop? Before it's too late. You think love awaits so you don't hold on. Oh, and then it's gone. How do you stop? You've had success, lots of fancy friends. You've tasted the good life. You thought it would never end. One day you're too young, then you're in your prime, then you're looking back at the hands of time. How do you stop? How do you stop? Before it's too late.
last set of the day for this episode of Crosswinds. See what we did there? A little bit lighter fare after some of the straight-up jazz that we've been playing the past hour or so. 4 songs in that set. We wrap it up with DC Talk from their album Jesus Freak. About 1995 or so is when that album was released. It's a song called Between You and Me. Before that, Joni Mitchell from her album Turbulent Indigo, joined on the track called How Do You Stop by Seal on the backing vocals. Prior to that, Take 6 from an album released in 1988 called Join the Band. Song originally recorded by Ambrosia back in the late 70s. Song that you heard was called Biggest Part of Me. And we started with Earth, Wind & Fire from 1975. Their album was Gratitude. Song you heard was called Sing a Song. I want to thank everybody for tuning in this episode of Crosswinds. A gentle reminder is that we do this every Sunday live here at the House of Prog, www.houseofprog.com. Come back next Sunday. We'll do this all over again, 11 a.m. until 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And the first hour of this program will always be big band music, and hopefully the DJ will not make any mistakes next week. Hope all of you have a wonderful week. Thank you so much for tuning in. We are going to leave you with something from Pat Metheny and Company. This goes all the way back to the first album by the band, self-titled album. Pat Metheny fans refer to it as the White Album because of the cover of the album. This is a classic concert piece that they do called Phase Dance. And until we meet again, may all of you be well, be blessed, and know that you are loved. You have been in Crosswinds, and I am the Mercurial Stranger.